It was a crisp, bright morning at a sprawling national park, where the air was filled with a solemn reverence as hundreds gathered to honor the country's veterans. President Trump, having just delivered a moving speech about the valor and sacrifices of America's heroes, stepped off the podium to mingle with the crowd. His speech had resonated deeply, evoking both tears and applause as he spoke of duty, sacrifice, and the enduring spirit of the American soldier. As Trump moved among the attendees, shaking hands and exchanging a few words of gratitude with each person, he noticed a man standing quietly to the side. The man's demeanor was understated, yet there was something striking about him. His rugged appearance and the way his eyes seemed to carry the weight of countless untold stories. He wasn't clamoring for attention or a handshake, but Trump, drawn by an unspoken sense of gravity, made his way over to him. Extending his hand, Trump offered the same warm smile he'd given others that morning, but with an extra glimmer of curiosity. "You're a veteran, aren't you?" he asked, his tone both friendly and respectful. "Where did you serve?" The man took the president's hand in a firm but unassuming grip. His voice, though rough and weathered, carried a quiet strength as he replied, "Yes, sir, I served in Afghanistan." For a moment, Trump nodded, his expression one of appreciation. But before he could respond, the man added, almost as an afterthought yet with a profound weight, "But what's remarkable about me isn't where I fought. It's that I returned from the dead." The words hung in the air, startling in their simplicity, yet brimming with a mystery that demanded exploration. Trump froze, his handshake lingering as he studied the man's face more intently. His sharp instincts told him there was more to this encounter than met the eye. "From the dead?" Trump repeated, his voice filled with genuine intrigue and a trace of disbelief. "You've got to tell me this story." The man's lips curled into a faint, enigmatic smile, and he looked away briefly, as if gathering his thoughts. His eyes, deep, dark, and reflective, seemed to travel back to a place only he could see. Then, turning back to Trump, he said, "It's not an easy story to tell, sir, but if you've got the time, I think you'll want to hear it." Trump, always one to seize a moment that felt significant, gestured for the man to continue. The crowd around them seemed to quiet, sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Even the Secret Service agents, usually unflinching, appeared to relax slightly, giving the two men space as the president leaned in closer, his full attention now on the man who claimed to have defied death itself. The soldier fell silent for a moment, his gaze distant, as if he was being pulled back to a place and time that still haunted him. His expression was calm but heavy, the kind of look that only someone who had been through unimaginable pain could wear. When he began to speak, his voice was steady, but there was a faint tremor that betrayed the depth of his emotion. "It was one of those days you carry with you forever," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "The kind of day that leaves a mark you can't ever erase. We were deep in enemy territory, moving through rugged terrain under a blazing sun. Tensions were high. You could feel it in the air. That electricity that tells you something bad is coming." He glanced briefly at President Trump, as if to gauge whether he should continue, and then pressed on, his voice gaining strength. "We've been under fire all day. Bullets were whizzing past us, explosions shaking the ground beneath our feet. The noise was deafening, like the world itself was breaking apart. I remember thinking, this is it. This is how it ends. But you push those thoughts aside because you have to keep going, for your brothers, for the mission, for survival." The soldier paused, taking a deep breath. His expression darkened, his tone growing more somber. Then it happened. We walked right into an ambush. They were waiting for us, hidden in the shadows. And before we knew it, the air was filled with fire and smoke. I barely had time to react before I felt the blast. It was like the ground itself exploded beneath me, and the force threw me back like a rag doll. He stopped, his hand instinctively brushing against his side as if the memory of the injury still lingered. At first, I didn't even feel it, just the shock. You know? Like your brain hasn't caught up with your body yet. But then the pain hit me. It was sharp, hot, and relentless, like my whole body was screaming at me. I looked down and saw the blood. It was everywhere. It was pouring out of me so fast. I knew I didn't have much time. I tried to move, to crawl, to do something, but nothing worked. My body just wouldn't respond. The soldier's voice softened, almost as if he were speaking to himself, recounting a moment that had been burned into his memory. The sounds of the battle were still all around me. The explosions, the gunfire, the shouts of my comrades, but they started to feel distant, like they were coming from another world. It was like someone was slowly turning down the volume on life itself. And then came the cold. God, I've never felt anything like it. It wasn't just my body that was cold. It was like my very soul was shutting down, inch by inch. His voice faltered for a moment, and he closed his eyes briefly, as if to steady himself. When he opened them again, his gaze was intense, locked on Trump's. In that moment, I knew I didn't have much time left. I couldn't fight anymore, couldn't even speak. So, I did the only thing I could. I prayed. I don't remember exactly what I said. It was simple, something like, "Dear Lord, if this is my last hour, please take me into your care." I wasn't bargaining or begging. I was just letting go. He paused, his expression softening as he continued, his voice filled with a reverence that made the air around him feel heavier. And then it happened, something I still can't fully explain. I felt a presence. It was as real as the ground I was lying on, as real as the blood on my hands. It was like an invisible hand reached down and touched me, not just my body, but my soul. It wasn't human strength, sir. It was something far greater. It was God. I know it in my heart. His voice grew quieter, more reflective, as he spoke of what came next. In that moment, everything changed. The pain, the fear, the chaos, they were just gone. I felt peace, pure and unshakable, like I was being held in the hands of something so much bigger than myself. It was extraordinary. I've faced death before, sir, but this was different. It was like being seen for the first time, like my life mattered in a way I had never understood before. He paused again, his eyes glistening with emotion. There was a faint, almost wistful smile on his face as he concluded. I can't explain it, not in a way that makes sense, but I know it was real. It was God who lifted me when I thought there was nothing left. He saw me when I felt invisible, gave me strength when I had none. That's the truth. As the soldier fell silent, his words hung in the air like a sacred echo. The crowd around him seemed frozen in place, their breaths held as if they were afraid to disturb the gravity of the moment. Even President Trump, a man known for his larger-than-life presence, stood quietly, his expression softened and thoughtful. The story had touched something deep, something unspoken, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to stand still. The soldier's voice softened, dropping to almost a whisper, as though the memory he was about to share was sacred, a fragment of another realm that demanded reverence. His gaze seemed to drift beyond the present, his eyes shimmering with the weight of what he had seen and felt. He took a deep, steadying breath before he spoke again, his tone filled with awe. "When I was lying there," he began, his voice quiet but firm, "everything around me started to fade. The noise of the battle, the gunfire, the explosions, the shouts, it all began to dim, as if someone were turning down the volume on the world. Even the pain, it started to slip away. It was like I was being pulled away, away from the battlefield, away from my own body. The crowd listened intently, the space between them and the soldier shrinking with every word. Trump leaned forward slightly, his sharp eyes focused on the man before him. Everything became quiet, the soldier continued. Not an eerie kind of quiet, but something different, calm, peaceful, like the world was being wrapped in a blanket of stillness. And then, he hesitated, as if searching for the right words. And then I saw it. His gaze shifted slightly, as though he were looking through time itself, back to the moment that had changed his life forever. A light, he said, his voice trembling just enough to reveal the depth of his emotion. Not just any light, it was radiant, pure, and warm. It wasn't harsh or blinding like the sun. It was soft, welcoming. It felt alive, as if it were reaching out to me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, but somehow, I wasn't scared. In fact, it was the most peaceful feeling I've ever experienced, like I was exactly where I was meant to be. He paused, taking a moment to collect himself, his hand brushing lightly against his chest as if grounding himself in the present. His voice, though quiet, carried a weight that seemed to press on everyone in the room. And then, through the light, I saw them, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. Faces I hadn't seen in years. My mother, who passed away when I was just a boy. My grandfather, who taught me everything I knew about honor and faith. Even a buddy of mine from basic training who didn't make it home. They were all there, standing in the light, smiling at me. The soldier stopped, his throat tightening. For a moment, he looked down, his hands clasped together as he steadied himself. Then he lifted his gaze to meet Trump's, his eyes filled with an unshakable certainty. It wasn't a dream. Mr. President, he said firmly, it was real. I felt it, not just in my mind, but in my soul. He paused, his voice faltering slightly as he pressed on. They didn't speak with words, but somehow, I understood them perfectly. It was like they were speaking directly to my heart. My grandfather stepped forward, and though his lips never moved, I heard him as clearly as I'm speaking to you now. He said, "Your time has not yet come. You must return to be a light for others." The soldier's voice wavered as he relived the moment, the weight of the memory etched deeply into his face. At first, I didn't want to go back, he admitted. I was so tired, so ready to let go. Being in that light, with them, it felt so right. But they kept smiling at me, not with pity, but with love, as if they were telling me it was okay, that I still had work to do, that my story wasn't finished yet. He paused again, his gaze distant, the memory vivid and alive in his mind. And then, just as quickly as it began, the light started to fade. The faces of my loved ones grew dim, and the warmth began to slip away. I felt myself being pulled back to the noise, the chaos, the pain. The soldier's voice dropped to a near whisper, filled with a quiet intensity that seemed to draw the room closer. When I woke up, I was back on the battlefield, lying in the dirt. My brothers were there, pulling me to safety. I could hear their voices shouting, and that's when I realized I was alive. Somehow, against all odds, I had been given a second chance. He turned to Trump, his gaze steady and unwavering, his voice now carrying the weight of a man who had faced death and returned with a renewed purpose. Mr. President, that moment changed everything for me. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about living with meaning. I knew then, and I know now, that God kept me here for a reason. Every day since, I've tried to live up to that purpose. The soldier paused once more, his expression resolute but reflective. I don't pretend to understand why I was chosen to stay when so many others didn't, but I know this, that light, that message, it wasn't just for me. It's something I carry with me. to share with others who might be in their own darkness, who might need a little light to guide them. As the soldier fell silent, his words hung in the air, heavy yet comforting, like a hymn that touched every heart present. The crowd had grown completely still, as if the sacredness of his story had captivated everyone within earshot. Even President Trump, usually so commanding and larger than life, seemed humbled, nodding slowly as he absorbed the depth and power of what had just been shared. The soldier took a slow, steady breath, as if bracing himself for the weight of the memory he was about to share. His voice grew firmer, though it carried an undertone of awe, the kind of reverence one might reserve for an encounter with the divine. His eyes flickered with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude, as though the memory itself still felt surreal. Even after all this time, when my comrades found me, he began, his voice low but steady, they thought I was gone. And honestly, I don't blame them. By every measure, I was. My body was still, motionless, pale, lifeless. There was no pulse. They checked me over and over again, but there was nothing, no sign of life. They told me later that they started saying their goodbyes right there on the battlefield, thinking there wasn't a thing they could do to bring me back. He paused, his voice softening, growing more reflective as his gaze dropped to the ground. His hands clenched slightly, as if trying to anchor himself to the present. They didn't give up on me easily, though. These were my brothers, men who had stood by me through everything. They stayed with me, even when hope was slipping away. One of them told me later that he just kept praying, asking God to help us, to bring me back. And then it happened. The soldier's voice grew quieter, but the intensity in his tone pulled everyone closer. Something happened, something no one could explain. Just when they thought I was lost for good, my heart started beating again. It wasn't gradual or slow. It was sudden, like a jolt, like a spark out of nowhere. My chest rose, and I gasped for air. My buddies, who had been kneeling over me, were stunned. They said it was like watching someone come back to life. He stopped for a moment, his hands gripping each other tightly, his expression distant as if replaying the scene in his mind. When I opened my eyes, I didn't know what had happened. All I knew was that I was alive. I could feel the dirt beneath me, the heat of the sun on my face. And then I saw them, my brothers, standing around me, their faces a mix of disbelief and joy. I didn't understand it then, but their tears told me everything I needed to know. These were men who'd seen the worst of war, men who rarely showed emotion. And there they were, breaking down like children because they thought I was gone. The soldier's voice thickened slightly with emotion, but he pressed on, his tone steadying as he looked back at Trump. The doctors later told me they couldn't explain it. They said I had been gone too long, that the injuries I'd sustained, the blood loss, the trauma, made survival impossible. They called it medically inexplicable. But I knew better. I knew exactly what it was. It was a miracle, plain and simple. It wasn't science or chance, it was God. His voice grew more emphatic, his conviction unshakable as he continued. It wasn't just some random act of fate, Mr. President. It was something greater. It was as if God himself reached down, placed his hand on me, and said, "Not yet." He gave me my life back, and from that moment on, I knew that life wasn't something I could waste. I had been spared for a reason. The crowd around him was silent, captivated by the raw honesty and power of his words. Trump, who had been listening intently, leaned in slightly, his expression a mixture of admiration and awe. Slowly, the president placed a firm hand on the soldier's shoulder, a gesture of respect and solidarity. "Your story," Trump began, his voice deliberate and steady, "is a testament to the power of faith and courage. It's a reminder that sometimes there's a higher plan at work, even when we don't understand it. You embody everything that's best about the American soldier: strength, resilience, and a belief in something greater than yourself." The president turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. His voice rose, not in volume, but in intensity, carrying the gravity of the moment. "This man, this story, it's why we honor our veterans, because they remind us of the power of the human spirit, the depth of sacrifice, and the grace of a God who watches over us all." The soldier nodded quietly, his emotions visible but contained. His story wasn't just one of survival, it was one of purpose, a message that had grown in clarity with every passing day since that miraculous moment. It was a story he knew he needed to share, not just with the people standing before him, but with anyone who might find themselves in their own battles, searching for hope and meaning. The weight of the soldier's story hung in the air, thick with emotion and reverence, leaving everyone around profoundly moved. President Trump, known for his commanding presence, stood quietly, absorbing every word with a solemn expression. The crowd, which had initially been filled with murmurs, whispers, and the occasional shuffling of feet, was now silent, as though the world itself had stopped to listen. It was clear to all that this was more than just a story. It was a moment, an experience that demanded reflection. Trump, ever aware of the gravity of such moments, turned to his team with a subtle nod and then looked out at the sea of faces before him. With a gesture that carried both authority and admiration, he motioned for the soldier to join him on the stage. His voice, rich and resonant, filled the space as he addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone strong yet tinged with emotion, "we have just heard a story that transcends words, a story of extraordinary faith, courage, and resilience. The man standing before us is not just a soldier. He is a living testament to the strength of the American spirit and the grace of God. It is a story that deserves to be heard by all of us." The applause that followed was thunderous, a wave of appreciation and respect rolling through the crowd. The soldier, visibly moved but composed, stepped forward with deliberate care. His steps were slow, measured, as though each carried the weight of the story he bore. Reaching the microphone, he paused, adjusting it with hands that trembled, not from fear, but from the enormity of what he was about to share. His weathered face reflected both humility and quiet determination. Clearing his throat, he began to speak, his voice strong yet laced with raw emotion. "Faith brought me back," he said, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. "And I believe every single one of us is here for a reason. We have a mission, a purpose that we are meant to fulfill. I shouldn't be standing here today. By all accounts, I should have died out there on that battlefield, but I didn't. And that wasn't by accident." The crowd hung on his every word, their eyes fixed on him with a collective intensity. He paused briefly, allowing his statement to settle, before continuing, his tone gaining strength. "I know what it feels like to be in the darkest of places," he said, his voice steady and assured. "I've been there. I've felt the kind of despair that makes you think there's no way out. I've faced moments where I wanted to give up, where I thought it was the end. But let me tell you something, there is always light. Even when you can't see it, there is always a reason to keep going, even when everything inside you tells you otherwise." His words struck a chord, and several members of the audience wiped away tears. Others nodded, their expressions a mix of empathy and admiration. The soldier took a deep breath, leaning slightly closer to the microphone, his voice carrying a quiet but powerful intensity. "Never lose hope," he said, his words deliberate and heartfelt. "No matter how dark things may seem, there's always a way forward. Hope is what kept me alive when everything else told me to give up, and hope will carry you through whatever you're facing." He leaned forward slightly, gripping the edges of the podium, As though anchoring himself in the moment, his gaze swept over the crowd, his tone growing even more impassioned. "Here's what I've learned from my journey," he continued. "We're not here just for ourselves. Life isn't about what you can take. It's about what you can give. It's about how you can make a difference for someone else. Be the hand that reaches out, the voice that says, 'You're not alone.' Live your life in a way that helps others, that brings light to those who are struggling in their own darkness. That's how we honor the gifts we've been given. That's how we make a real impact." The applause that erupted was deafening, a powerful outpouring of respect and admiration that rippled through the gathering like a tidal wave. People rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, and wiping their eyes. The atmosphere was electric, as though the soldier's words had ignited something profound within each person present. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause, allowing everyone to reflect on the deeper meaning of life, service, and the unyielding power of faith. As the soldier stepped back from the podium, his face bore an expression of both humility and quiet resolve. He glanced at Trump, who was clapping along with the crowd, his expression filled with respect and a rare sense of solemnity. The president gave a small nod, an unspoken acknowledgement of the gravity of what had just been shared. This wasn't merely a story of survival. It was a call to action, a challenge to live with purpose, to find strength in faith, and to be a light for others. And as the soldier left the stage, the impact of his words lingered, not just in the hearts of those who had heard him, but in the very air, as though something sacred had been left behind. As the applause gradually faded, President Trump walked over to the soldier, his expression one of admiration and respect. Reaching out, he firmly shook the man's hand, then placed his other hand gently on the soldier's shoulder, a gesture of gratitude, but also one of solidarity. Trump stood beside him, not as a politician, but as a man acknowledging the profound weight of the story he had just heard. Turning back to the crowd, Trump's voice carried a rare tone of emotion, resonant and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have heard today is more than just a story. It is a testament to what makes America great: faith, courage, and sacrifice. It is men and women like this soldier who embody the very backbone of our nation, who remind us that even in the darkest moments, there is hope, there is purpose, and there is God." The crowd erupted in applause once again, many rising to their feet. Trump paused, allowing the moment to breathe, his gaze sweeping across the faces before him. His expression softened as he continued, his tone growing more personal. "This soldier's story isn't just his, it's ours. It's the story of a nation that refuses to give up, a people who draw strength from their faith and each other. It's a story that reminds us that we are one nation under God, indivisible, with a shared mission to protect the freedoms and values we hold dear." He turned to the soldier, his words directed to him, but meant for everyone to hear. "You are a hero, not just because of what you've endured, but because of what you've chosen to do with it. Your faith, your resilience, your commitment to serving others. These are the qualities that inspire us all to be better, to do better, to live with purpose." The soldier nodded humbly, his eyes misting over. Trump then stepped closer to the podium, addressing the audience one final time. "I hope we all take something away from this today. Let's remember the sacrifices of our soldiers, not just on days like this, but every day. Let's honor their courage by living lives of gratitude, service, and faith." The ceremony began to wind down, but the energy in the crowd remained electric, as though everyone had been touched by something larger than themselves. The soldier stepped down from the stage, greeted by a sea of handshakes, embraces, and words of thanks from strangers who now felt like they knew him. Many spoke through tears, telling him how much his story had moved them, how it had reignited their own sense of hope and purpose. As the event concluded and people began to disperse, the soldier lingered for a moment. Looking back at the stage where he had stood moments earlier, he felt a deep sense of peace, as though he had fulfilled a part of the mission he believed God had entrusted to him. His heart swelled with gratitude, not just for the second chance he had been given, but for the opportunity to share his story and touch the lives of others. Walking away, the soldier carried with him a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that his journey was far from over, and that his story was only the beginning of a greater calling, to be a beacon of light and a voice of hope for those still searching for their own.